Well, I've given you quite a few analogies to think about as we've been talking about qualitative and quantitative research, and I want you to keep those in mind that they're two sides of the same coin, that they're like long lost twins that were separated at birth, and as we're going to talk about in this lecture, that qualitative and quantitative research are an awful lot like Batman and Superman. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this lecture series, part of my background includes work in the comic book industry. And it might not surprise you that from time to time, I relate what I'm doing now in marketing research back to my days working in a world where superheroes loomed large. And since we're in the middle of a lecture series, and you can probably use a little bit of a shift of focus from the high-minded philosophy of science that we've been discussing, now seems like a good time to educate you a little bit on two of the greatest superheroes there ever were. That's right, Superman and Batman. Now, I'm going to start by telling you that despite what popular culture may be telling you right now with the Batman versus Superman film that's coming up, Batman and Superman are historically friends, not enemies. The two of them were both popular characters in the golden age of comics in the 1930s and 1940s, and they were some of the most enduring characters in popular culture throughout what we now call the Silver and Bronze Ages. They often teamed up and eventually became members of the Justice League of America, as well as other groups like the cheesy cartoon show Super Friends. While the comic books featuring these characters would sometimes have them match wits against each other or get tricked into fighting, most comic book fans consider the 1986 comic book miniseries by Frank Miller, The Dark Knight Returns, to be the moment where Batman and Superman really squared off as enemies. And that story was actually never part of the continuity of the characters. It was instead a what-if story about a future where Batman came out of retirement and destroyed himself to become an inspirational icon to a crumbling America. So it completely made sense for him to battle Superman, and since it was a Batman comic after all, to actually win. Since then, there have been a handful of fights between the characters, and the comic books have really played up the idea that the two of them don't see eye to eye in many ways. In fact, their difference in perspective is what makes them both so interesting as foils against each other. So, how are they different? Well, let's look at Superman first. As you probably know, Superman isn't really a human. He's an alien who is sent to the planet Earth as a baby and who draws his powers from the yellow sun at the center of our solar system. Back on his home planet of Krypton, he'd be nothing special, but on Earth, he's able to be super in every sense of the word. Super strong, super smart, super fast, has super senses, and to be able to fly. In addition to all of that, he can shoot laser beams out of his eyes, he can see through walls with his X-ray vision, and he can create tornadoes with his breath. What's more, if it's convenient for the writers, he can gain other powers as well. Now, if Superman's having trouble gaining perspective, he can launch himself into the sky and get a bird's eye view of the area around him. And when Superman's out on patrol, he can fly around the city of Metropolis and hear the cries of people in distress. And since Superman also has a secret identity as reporter Clark Kent, he can blend into society and keep his ear on the cultural rail, often learning about big happenings from his friends Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen. But this secret identity is more of a convenience for Superman than a necessity. He uses it so he can walk among humans in secret and pretend to be one of us, not because he's necessarily trying to protect anyone from harm. In fact, the people that know him as Clark Kent also tend to know him separately as Superman, and this leads to a lot of trouble for them when his foes are looking for someone to kidnap or influence, Lois Lane in particular. Now, Superman, he's a pretty formidable superhero, and he's arguably the strongest and most capable of them all. In fact, most superheroes are copied off of Superman, I'm sure you know. But he does have some weaknesses. First of all, he's weak to kryptonite. That's a remnant from his home planet that takes away his powers temporarily or can even do permanent harm if it's the right kind. Second, Superman has a tendency to rely on his super strength and just start punching everything rather than finding ways to outwit his enemies. And in fact, this is actually kind of a joke in the comic book world now about how Superman's solution to everything is to just punch it. Because of this, Superman has an extremely poor understanding of his enemies and their enterprises, often focusing on going after the chief villain instead of wasting his time with their minions. And this also means Superman can be quite easily manipulated into doing things that benefit his enemies, and which he then has to undo, especially when they exploit his heroic code or his nationalism towards truth, justice, and the American way. Now let's compare Superman to Batman for a moment. Batman is just a regular human being. He's got no superpowers, but he's extraordinary in every way. He's very intelligent, very wealthy, and highly skilled in many ways. One of his primary skill sets is being an excellent detective. Batman uses traditional deductive and inductive reasoning to solve cases, as well as tools of forensic science and secondary data he has access to in order to track down the criminals that he's going after. Another one of his skill sets involves being a master martial artist. Batman's not only extremely formidable as a hand-to-hand fighter, but he's also trained in the use of weapons that he's specially designed, like the batarangs or his grappling hook, or more sophisticated equipment like the Batwing or the Batmobile. Now, Batman's weaknesses are the very things he tries to cover up. He's as vulnerable to bullets and explosions as anyone. He's deeply emotionally scarred because of witnessing the murder of his parents when he was a little boy. And he has a secret identity that puts himself and his allies at risk if it ever becomes public knowledge. Batman also has a code against killing. That means he'll let his enemies live to see another fight if they can escape from confinement, as they often do. That's why, more than anything, Batman's chief weapon is psychology. He doesn't dress like a bat because he thinks it looks cool. He does so because he realizes that bats are terrifying, and he wants to strike fear into the hearts of the criminals he's facing. And in fact, if you go back to the original Batman origin story, it talks about how he has become this weird creature of the night. It's always been a part of his character. As Batman has evolved, it's been revealed that he wears a cape to distract his opponents from his movements. He has a bat sigil on his chest to encourage them to shoot him where his bulletproof armor is the strongest. He wears dark colors so that he'll blend more effectively into the shadows and be more like an apparition than a man. The man beneath the costume covers up all of his vulnerabilities by considering what makes him the most fearsome and seemingly supernatural. And that level of deep understanding favors Batman because he understands the criminal enterprises of Gotham City from the ground up. He can shake down low-level characters for information, and he can track the movements of those he's investigating by watching their soldiers and lieutenants. He can also make use of his connections to the power structures in Gotham City to obtain additional information when he needs it. Batman keeps detailed records on everyone he encounters and often has a personal history with the villains that he faces. This might be one of the reasons Batman has such a great number of memorable and nuanced villains to face compared to Superman. And if you can name more than a handful of Superman villains off the top of your head, you're a better person than I am. Each of Batman's villains reflect a piece of who he is, and a big part of his story is his personal conflict with what they represent. But let's think for a moment about how Superman and Batman represent qualitative and quantitative research, because the parallels are actually pretty striking. So Superman's perspective is very similar to a quantitative perspective. He has a broad understanding of the world, and even though he lacks a depth of understanding, he can look at things from a far-out view or drill down to individual units with an amazing level of precision and speed. But Superman's solutions to the problems he faces are generally limited to a discrete number of actions. Though he's brimming with superpowers, much of his technique boils down to just punching his enemies until they surrender. Quantitative research, which is so rooted in using surveys and generating flurries of numbers, has the same tendency. Qualitative research, by comparison, is much more like Batman's perspective. Batman spends a lot of his time investigating his enemies and learning from them. When he faces his foes, he often knows exactly what he needs to do to dispatch them, and he has a creative array of techniques at his disposal to do so. Batman's biggest problem is that he's so engaged in the process of gathering data and solving problems that he never really takes a break, and in fact this is one of his big character flaws in the comics. He has to build complex systems and even enlist the help of others to manage the massive troves of data that he collects, and because he's so vulnerable, he constantly has to increase his capabilities to stay competitive. Batman's skills as a superhero are only truly possible because of his wealth and his extensive training. And by the way, very similar to the way that qualitative research works. Qualitative research is extremely expensive, and the skill set required for it often involves continued training and learning new techniques as you go along. Now, in the comic book world, as I mentioned, Batman and Superman aren't actually enemies. They're generally friends who can overcome each other's weaknesses by working together as a team. And while the various stories about them have shown Batman to be quite pragmatic about Superman's raw power, and Superman being suspicious of Batman's tendency to jump to conclusions, the two are aligned in their desire to be heroes rather than villains, and they're effective at watching each other's backs and being a force for good. What's more, they're also part of a bigger team. The bigger team is, of course, called the Justice League. And that helps them to further expand their capabilities and overcome their weaknesses, much like the many fields that touch on marketing research help us to enhance the work that pure qualitative and quantitative research can't quite achieve on their own. When qualitative research and quantitative research are used together, they can become a powerful force that's not easily stopped. But you know what? It's really up to us as researchers to understand their applications and to ensure they're used correctly to resolve research problems. And while we're not going to talk about quantitative research much more in this class, because you're going to have a lot of other classes that will, we are going to keep learning about qualitative research. After all, Superman may be the template from which so many other superheroes have been copied, but Batman, he's been around almost as long, and from my point of view as a comic book fan and a fan of qualitative research, he's the far more interesting of the two.